which will go into way more detail about what I'm going to be talking about. So hopefully this should act as like a nice overview to the movement of open science, which it sounds like you're all experts in anyway. So if you're going to challenge me on anything, please do put your hand up. It'd be great to talk about anything that I might have missed in this. Yeah, thanks Sam for inviting me. I'm a PhD student at the moment in neuroimaging. I actually don't do any neuroimaging, I do loads of drug studies. So maybe I'm in the wrong place, I don't know. But today I'm going to talk to you a bit about how I'm using open science in my PhD, more broadly what tools are available, and then also trying to introduce some of my data and how the process of open science has helped shape the way I've tried to collect that and talk about collecting it. So, first of all, I think open science, or at least transparent rule, we've got Game of Thrones fans in here, because otherwise a lot of these jokes are going to fall really flat. That's going to be terrible for my topic. Okay, fine. So, a lot of people tend to think open science is a bit like this fella, who, if you haven't seen Game of Thrones, is a bit of a dick, and he sort of is going to come in and kill everyone, really. And I think a lot of academics tend to see the idea of transparency as a bit like this, as in coming in to the field of what they're doing and trying to sort of explode it from the inside and sort of show everyone how untransparent they're being, which in some cases is fair because a lot of people are untransparent. But also, this is meant to kind of safeguard, I think, a lot of early career researchers in how they conduct science and how we can actually improve the way that we share results. And so hopefully we're going to reframe this fella into someone who's a lot more benign and helpful to what we want to do. So I'm going to talk about pre-registration, open data, open analysis and preprints, and also the tools that you can use which are fully open and free to try and enable you to also do the same things for your projects. And hopefully we'll have, I think we've got an hour, haven't we? So we'll hopefully have plenty of time at the end to talk if anyone wants to discuss their projects or share anything that I might have missed. And I'm also going to be using, as I said, some examples from my recent experiment looking into paranoia online to have a look at the sort of social cognition of how paranoia might act itself in live interactions. But first, I want to give a good example of open science, which NASA and physics have had down for quite a long time. And realistically, all neuroscientists and psychologists really just do want to be physicists, really. So I'm going to talk a little bit about NASA and how they sort of quite selflessly share their data around, and it actually contributes to the advancement of knowledge about, in this case, moon rocks, which I know nothing about, but I do know that the way that they do it means that for the people that are experts, they're advancing their knowledge a lot quicker than if people hoarded this information to themselves. So, in 1969 to 1972, this geologist who turned astronaut, along with another team of astronauts, went to the moon, collected a bunch of lunar rocks, core samples, pebbles, sand and dust, which I'm sure has meaningful information in it, but I don't know. But they weren't collecting it for the purpose of analysis right then. They wanted to collect it to keep it safe for 30 years so that scientists in the future could then uncover it and take a look with new advanced technology about what that might be telling us about our physical world. So, quite understandably, this is an incredibly selfless thing. Can you imagine collecting data now through your PhDs or postdocs or wherever you're at, for them to say, well, actually, I'm not going to use this for my work. I'm going to give this to my student in 30 years, who's then going to use that to publish on their own. Might seem a bit strange, but it has led to the advancement of technology and the advancement of knowledge about what these samples can tell us, because the hard work was done, shared, and then collected and produced to lead us to something that we wouldn't have otherwise been able to tell without this kind of hard work. And this is a really nice example of someone who has been there through the whole process. So Dr. Darby Dyer, she started analysing the samples as an undergraduate way before, I think in the 80s. And they didn't quite look at everything then, but now she's head of a team studying the core samples that they originally collected in 1969-72. So not necessarily, I just thought it was a nice case study to show the whole movement of someone going through the whole project. And as you might have inferred, this was a kind of a collaboration between a few nations. It wasn't just Japan and the USA, there were also more nations that were involved in this. And also the sharing of data across institutions. So again, this is still something I think that seems a bit alien, the idea that we collect those data and immediately send it off to someone else to look at. But actually it's really crucial for the way that we can advance our understanding of a particular topic. So you all might be familiar with this, which is kind of the open science wheel of how we can design a study to be completely transparent and able to be shared, not just across the researchers in our field, but worldwide, so other people could take a look, assess our work, maybe do something interesting that we'd never thought of. And we're going to go through this step by step, not quite segment by segment because that'll take forever, but we're going to go through it chunk by chunk and try and understand what tools we can use to try and implement this. So, step one, which you might have seen here, we want to search and discover, develop ideas and design our study really. So how we go setting about a useful research question that we can then go and test. So the problem that we have traditionally is that once we've collected once we've had ideas and collected data, we haven't already kind of written this down somewhere, which we might have made a mental note of, we might have even made notes somewhere else. But inevitably after we've collected the data, that data is then going to influence our ideas, even if we don't mean any malintent. So the post-diction means that post-hoc ideas are overinflated and accepted as reality. And again, this isn't something that we're necessarily aware of. This is a complete bias that we just have innately within us because we're humans. And so it's really, really important to get your ideas somewhere that are a bit more solid than just kind of writing them down mentally or sharing them with your lab. So that once you've collected that data, you're held to account by your own ideas before that process has started. And I just really like this quote from Tversky, which is written in a paper by Brian Nosek, who runs the Open Science Foundation. And again, this kind of post-diction, you can almost simulate yourself in other situations. And again, if there's Game of Thrones fans out there and you've watched the most recent season, sort of watching the most recent season, you might then kind of be maybe disappointed, but then after you've watched it, try and kind of come up with some ideas to explain actually why they might have written it like that, and maybe it wasn't quite as crap as you thought it was when you watched it. So this is an active and analogous way that this post-diction works. You've seen the data, you've seen the episodes. At the time you probably were a bit disappointed, but then after the fact, if you're like me, you try and convince yourself that actually they'd meant to do it that way all along. Just out of interest, Lost did this as well, and that was 10 years of my life that I wasted. So, pre-registration, first of all, trying to get your ideas down somewhere tangible that you can then hold to account once you've collected the data. And it's a bit like a recipe, in that it's a set of predictions and a sort of a plan that you're wanting to try and stick to as you go along the process. And this reduces hypothesizing after the results are known, as I said before, with this post-diction problem. And it also stops p-hacking, which is effectively going through your data and doing every single analysis possible, finding a significant result and saying, we predicted that all along. And it minimises false positives in the data. However, it doesn't prevent you from sort of looking at the data transparently in an exploratory way afterwards. It just makes sure that your predictions and your exploratory analyses are separated quite clearly in your paper. So it's not stopping you from doing anything new and interesting, because that's kind of some of the excitement of science, but actually it's just then stopping you from going, well, we thought this idea all along and this is kind of how reality actually is. So just coming back to my project for a second, we wanted to look at how paranoia as a trait of people's personalities might influence how you interact with other people in a social decision-making task. This was important because previously there's this sort of social bias that was found in the general population where harm was perceived as much more intended by someone, even if the outcomes were similar. Harm was perceived to be a lot stronger in a social interaction, even if the outcomes were similar, if the person had intended to do it. So just by framing something with an intention, you immediately think someone's trying to be more harmful, even if the outcomes of intention and non-intention are exactly the same. And they kind of showed that paranoia, using this paradigm, bumped that up as well. So even in a non-clinical population, paranoia is spread throughout in a continuum, effectively. And they showed that in social decision-making, being paranoid bumped that up as well slightly, but it didn't really tell us anything about how sensitive you might be in an ongoing interaction. So what we wanted to do is test in a multi-round game online, using a social decision-making task, could we predict that paranoia would increase the amount of harm that you think is intended from someone else just from an unfair decision? And we use as predicted for this. It's aspredicted.com, maybe it's .org, I'll tell you at the end. And effectively, all we did is write a recipe down for what we thought might happen in our experiment. And we conducted the experiment online, so we wrote that in. We wrote in a basic analysis plan that we wanted to conduct, given the data that we thought we might collect. And we registered it online so that once you press submit, it's just there in the ether, I can't change it. And you can also reference it in your paper to say, this is what we thought before. And it doesn't need to be long. As predicted is probably the quickest way of doing this. The Open Science Foundation has kind of a longer process. But as predicted has a nice quick and dirty solution, maybe just quick, not necessarily dirty, about writing maybe in about 1,000 words, just what you want to do. It doesn't need to be anything really, really detailed, but just a general outline of what your ideas are and how you're intending to analyse it. Again, you can steer off that, but it's just good to have a baseline through which you can then refer people to if you do move away. So we've designed our study. At the moment we're in the process of designing our study, and we want to collect our data. So, I'm going to talk about online platforms as well here, because they're incredibly useful for doing any sort of behavioural or social decision-making task that you want to validate, or if you want to collect large numbers incredibly quickly. So this is not necessarily something to do with open science, although the online platforms that I am going to refer you to do have the ability to share experiments or share your ideas so that people can see exactly what you've done and exactly the pipeline that you've used. These platforms are also really useful for lab studies because you can construct your whole experimental paradigm in a very sort of easy visual manner and give the same thing to everybody. So it's very repeatable. And in our experiment, we collected about 1,500 people in the space of about 48 hours. So it's incredibly quick to get massive numbers, especially if you've got really solid decision-making game or something equivalent. But I'm going to be talking from a decision-making point of view because that's my bias in this, I suppose. In KCL, we have subscriptions to Qualtrics, which is basically an online survey tool. Fairly useful if you just kind of want to have something that you can randomise questionnaires, surveys. To some degree, you can design behavioural tasks if you're quite savvy with how to use it. It doesn't take that long to learn. And also we have a relationship with Gorilla.sc at the moment, which is also an experimental paradigm building thing. And I'm not paid by Gorilla or Qualtrics or anything. I've just particularly found these useful in my work. And I think a few other people are starting to adopt it because it does provide quite an easy platform to design things. So using my worked example in our experiment, we first asked participants online sort of some baseline things that you might expect from any study, so kind of anxiety, paranoia, interpersonal sensitivity, worry, using clinical questionnaires. We put this online into Qualtrics and Gorilla, and we got about 1,700. This is from 2 studies. So we got about 800 people in the space of 24 hours at 2 time points. So 1 week later, after asking people this, we asked them to play this kind of multi-round economic game and involving in social decision making. And they were going to play 3 people, each of them for about 6 trials, or 4-6 trials, and this was randomized. So it completely random about which person they play first. And it's a dictator game, so I don't know if you're familiar with a dictator game, but basically you're playing against someone else, and your partner says, this is a split of the money I'm going to give you, and you have really no opinion in whether you take it or not take it, you just have to take the money that is split with you. And then afterwards, we ask people to rate, after the decision, how much do you think this person was intending you harm from that decision, and how much do you think this person was just interested in earning money for themselves? So arguably, the most sort of parsimonious argument would be that the person's just interested in earning money, if they're taking all of it, right? But there is some ambiguity there as to whether they're actually trying to take money away from you or reduce your bonus. So this is really useful for tapping into paranoia, because any ambiguous situation like that tends to bring out these traits in us. So we've collected our data, we've put things online, we've pre-registered, we're all set up. ready to analyse and upload our data for everyone to see. And the use of software here to perform your analyses, I think, is quite crucial here. And inevitably, the software that allows you to do this at the moment requires you to code. And I would highly recommend, even if you don't code, if you use SPSS or something like that, you give coding a go, just because it's going to be really useful for your career, whether you're in academia or outside of academia. And also it means that your work will be fully transparent. You can share it across online to anyone that wants to look at it. They can run it in their own sort of local R or Python IDE, and they can try and reproduce exactly what you've done. And this is really useful and a bit scary, I have to say, because then a lot of people who are probably better at coding than I am will probably come back to me and be like, you've got a bunch of bugs in this code. But that's great, because then I can learn from it. The community can inform me what I'm doing wrong. And hopefully that's at a point at preprint before it's gone out to publication. And as we were saying before, coding it like this can also really helpfully split your analyses into confirmatory analyses, so you can write into your code exactly where your predictions are trying to be tested in this code, and also where exploratory analyses are. And it's really easy to delineate this in things like R or Python or MATLAB or whatever coding IDE you want to use. Coding can be downloaded and replicated. And personally, this is a little bit scary, and I'm sure scary for anyone who's putting their code online and isn't an expert like a lot of people are online. And so even if you don't particularly like the sound of coding at this point, even though I highly recommend it, in R and Python, you can use these great software IDEs, which basically run like SPSS, where you can select which analyses you want to do, but they reproduce the code for you so you can still share it online. So this is Jamovi and JASP, J-A-S-P, and they basically run this code in a really usable format like SPSS. It doesn't look like SPSS, but it has the same sort of feel to it. You select your data, you select what analyses you can perform, except that at the back end of that, you can take the code, put it online, someone else can look at it, and it will probably actually be better than my code that I try to write in R on my own, for example, because it's all nicely neat and packed. And also, of course, if you're a MATLAB user, there's a lot of kind of rivalry between whether you use R, Python, or MATLAB, but in essence, they're all effectively equivocal. So if you're a MATLAB coder and that's what you like sticking with, that's brilliant. Just share your code online so people can see it as well. So now that we've collected our data, we've pre-registered everything, we've decided that we're going to code, I've got my R IDE open, I'm all ready to analyse. Here's some of the results that we collected. So this is just a spread of paranoia in the general population. This is not a clinical population, but as you can see, there's about 83 people in this large sample that are past the clinical mean for paranoia, but aren't seeking clinical help. So as you can see, it's a continuum spread across the general population, and acts as a trait. And we're not, paranoia does occur in mental illness like psychosis, and we think there might be some different processes going on to exhibit the same phenotype, but we tend to think of paranoia as a trait when we look at the general population. And there's my arrow to show you where the clinical threshold is.
Joe,
yes?
That doesn't look very normally distributed. Is it not a normally distributed trait?
No, so it's heavily skewed over to the left, which is low scores. So a lot of people tend to score very low, and then very few people tend to score very high. So definitely not a normally distributed trait like anxiety might be, or worry. But we deal with that by using non-parametric analyses to try and overcome that. So we're not treating it as a normal distribution. And just to kind of go over briefly some of my results, which I think are very interesting, but then again, I'm very biased because it's my work. So, when people were playing fair dictators, and they were quite past the clinical mean for paranoia, as paranoia increases incrementally, people tend to score even fair decisions as being a lot more harmful towards them than people who weren't very paranoid. So what we're trying to do is show that this is valid to then use in drug studies to test causal reasons for why paranoia might exist. But interestingly, also what we see is that even though people might be very paranoid at the start, it becomes non-significant by the end between paranoia, showing that given proper social enforcement and fairness over time, people who have quite high trait paranoia actually then respond to social enforcement in a way that you might expect, and this kind of suggests that it's not a social cognitive problem, more of a sensitivity. In unfair conditions, everyone scores highly in perceiving someone else to be harmful towards them if they have an unfair decision against them. So this tends to be just a general social cognitive bias that we all have, that when we receive an unfair decision, we tend to think someone's being more harmful towards us. But as you can see, the higher you go in paranoia, the more sensitive you are to that. There's no significance for self-interest, so we don't really think paranoia is really manipulating that other social cognitive aspect of thinking someone else is more self-interested following their decision. So, once we've got all this data, we've analysed it, it's brilliant, we want to put it out there for other people to see, and this can kind of feel like you're letting go of some of the, effectively, precious minerals like they're collected on the moon, all this stuff that you're taking all this time to try and cultivate, and then giving away to other people to have a look at and scrutinise and try and do their own thing with it. But if it's kind of like a prisoner's dilemma situation, whereas if we let other people use our data, it actually means that we progress faster and end up having better gains at the end of it if we all try and cooperate. And kind of holding on to your data might be more beneficial for you personally, but it does slow down the development of new and exciting findings that other people might have that you haven't thought of. So it allows the development of a new perspective on something that you created. So step 4, publish, which is the exciting step at the end, which we all hope to do. And before we get to a peer review situation, we can publish it in preprint archives, which means that you can rapidly disseminate your information. Whereas previously, I suppose, you would just email the people in your lab or email the people in your field with your paper. And it allows it to go on Twitter, inevitably, which seems to be the portal for everyone at the moment. And everyone have a look at your work and just kind of see those results straight away, even if it hasn't gone through the peer review process. And this isn't trying to replace peer review. I think it's just allowing a point where you can look at how a peer review has affected your writing or affected the way that you're presenting the results. And also allowing you to rapidly disseminate it. And as I said, it doesn't replace peer review, although inevitably open access and community-led journals are going to probably get rid of paywalls in the future. So SciArchive is the one I'm going to be using. Obviously, if you're in a more biological slant to things, you're going to be using bioRxiv, or the physics version of this is something for every discipline. But super easy to upload, you get a DOI, you can reference it, you can share it, super easy. So, hopefully I've introduced that we have a whole pipeline of things and tools that we can use from generating a study idea right through to publication, to allow our work to be a bit more transparent, to allow other people to take a look at what we've done and scrutinise, give different opinions, or just try and replicate exactly the code that we've used. And of course there are alternative tools to these aren't exclusive, but they're just some examples that I've used and I've found incredibly useful in the implementation of this in my own PhD. And of course this is all sort of under the umbrella of open science, and having an open science login and free kind of account means that all of this stuff can be really nicely itemised within a profile, so you can direct people towards your portfolio of work. Say, here's everything that I've done so far, even the stuff that's not published through peer review yet. Take a look at exactly all my data, feel free to take my code, that sort of thing. Thanks very much. I hope this has been a useful overview. Of course, if you've got perspectives that I haven't covered or I've missed out, please feel free to put your hand up and point them out to me. But any questions, happy to talk at this point. Yes?
Thanks very much, Joe. Have you found that other people take your data and then try and publish it?
You do, well, I mean, I'm not, for me personally, I've heard of a minority of cases where people take other people's data and try and use it as their own, but it's quite hard to do that if it's registered. And with the community now around science, it gets pointed out incredibly quickly, and then that person is sort of labelled as...
Because I had a funny situation where a chap contacted me about a Journal of Neuroscience paper I had and asked for the data. This was a few years ago, so that one of his students could practice some modelling. So I just gave him the data. And then I heard nothing for ages, and then he said, oh, we couldn't get that published. But it turns out that your data published in Journal of Neuroscience goes the opposite way to what we found. So we're going to publish a paper
So I think that will come out because of the community-led stuff like preprints and open data at the moment. Stuff like that will come out really quickly. It's really hard to hide that sort of thing because it's all transparent.
I don't know if he was doing it deliberately. I mean, he kind of was quite prickly and had some kind of rivalry thing, I think. So whether he was doing it, I don't know. But it was the wrong way. He just inverted the story.
You get people like that that will just take it and maybe run with it, but I think that they're in a minority, thankfully. And also in your case, I think it's hard. It would be hard for them to get away with that again, just because other people could look at it if they're also being transparent, which they should be. It's very easily rooted out. But I haven't had that happen to me, but I can imagine that's really frustrating. Yeah. Anyone else have any questions or yeah?
I'm a PhD student. I'm just going towards the analysis stage, and some of the things I need to do I've learned from courses at IOP how to do them in Stata.
Yeah.
And I'm kind of thinking, would it be worth learning R and doing the same thing in R so that I can kind of get these extra brownie points? How much of a kind of a problem would it be to kind of figure code out which was done in Stata?
I mean, that wouldn't be a problem at all. I think it's more about Stata tends to be a little bit more opaque in terms of the computations that go behind the code that you use. Because if I know correctly, I might be completely wrong, but in Stata you put in commands, you don't see the back-end mathematical processes that it goes through. So the one advantage of R and Python is that when you have a package, you can go back to the source and have a look at exactly how they're using that function to compute something. So it's a bit more open in terms of understanding exactly the mathematics that go behind it. Also, just from a career point of view, R and Python are used in loads and loads of other things outside of academia.
Yeah.
Whereas I haven't heard of anyone using Stata. So Stata, absolutely fine, show your code, that's brilliant. R, I would say, is useful just for the transparency of packages, and also if you wanted to transfer your skills somewhere else. Knowing R and Python can be really advantageous.
Thanks. And the stuff you say about JASP and Jamovi, could that work with Stata code? Could you put that in, do you think?
I don't think it uses, so it doesn't use commands. It's like a SPSS IDE, so you literally just have, so I think Jamovi is a Bayesian slanted IDE, and JASP is more your traditional kind of SPSS IDE. Both are just click. You kind of select your data, you click. It's like SPSS, and it'll come up and say which variables do you want in there.
Okay.
Really straightforward to use. I use it for kind of just if I want to do something really quickly, I just look at it in JASP or Jamovi to get a rough idea of what I'm trying to do. And then you can just take the analysis code and chuck it online. So it does it for you, and then it notes down everything that it's doing. So SPSS and Stata do that to a degree, but they don't show you the back-end functions, and you can't really probe that too much.
Okay, thanks.
That's all right.
Just on that point though, I mean, the broader picture is that you want to try and future-proof your career. And Python, I mean, there's a sort of rivalry now between Python and R. I mean, I use neither, both scare me, but I know that one day I'm going to have to take them on. Stata was the sort of poster boy for a sort of improvement to SPSS, but it's died. I mean, it's effectively died a death now, mainly because do you have to pay for it? I think, or it's a universal subscription, perhaps. But in any case, it's been rapidly overtaken by R and Python, which can do anything really, and so it's worth sort of investing. It's a really, really massive learning curve, and not one. It is just one of those extra things that you have to do to sort of get the edge on competition. But it is worth investing a bit of time in it. That's why in June we've got very gentle introductions to R.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's just to get your bearings with it. But yeah, it's almost a necessity.
Important thing to think though, from
Yeah, who does use R or Python here? Yeah, and I don't know if you're like me, but most of the time I spend just Googling how to do things in it. So once you've sort of learned, and I've been using it for a few years, so like once you've learned the basics, sort of how to code, almost like, I suppose, the equivalent of learning bits of Latin to learn Spanish and French and everything like that, I just Google the rest of the time to try and find out actually how to do things, because honestly there's so many things you can do. I couldn't remember it off the top of my head fluently, but Google or other search providers are available, is your ally in this. Yeah.
How imperative would you say it is to make a Twitter account? Because I don't have one. I've had enough of like having too many social media accounts, but people send me like links to jobs and things, and they would have found it on Twitter, and it would be like lab jobs and things like that. So obviously it's quite helpful in that sense.
I really like Twitter, so I'm probably a bit biased, but I only ever use it for kind of professional stuff. I don't do personal things on there, really. And I found it really useful just to disseminate things. If you're following loads of people who inevitably are academics in my circle, then you just follow it. You just follow people, and hopefully they'll follow you back if they see that you've done that, and then you share something, and everyone can just retweet it, and it can gain a bit of steam. But also, I quite like it actually, not even just for kind of prolific purposes, but in the morning, I quite like looking at Twitter, because most of the people that I'm following have interesting research coming out that I probably wouldn't have thought to Google. So I get loads of lateral, interesting science pop up on my feed that I can quickly then just read in the morning as like a, catching up to date on things. Exactly, it's like a cultivated news feed of the things that you're interested in, and the more that you tweet about things, the more you kind of cultivate your own style of doing that. Again, it does require effort. I'm probably on it too much, but I found it a really useful tool just to get things out there, and also to receive things I wouldn't have otherwise probably looked for.
Cool. Get a Twitter account. You have to have a Twitter account.
I feel like it's finding that balance, isn't it, between making sure it's a productive platform versus something you use to procrastinate.
I do a lot of procrastination.
Yeah,
as well.
that's why.
But I like to think that my procrastination is okay on it, because I'm looking at only mainly science stuff. So maybe productive procrastination, I don't know. That's what I tell myself anyway. Any other thoughts or things I've missed that you had a perspective on? Yes.
Sorry, I've got one more question about, I guess, with consent.
Yeah.
So, I would like to put my data online, and so I've collected a clinical sample in eating disorders. I'm pretty sure that, from my perspective, I could anonymise it in such a way, maybe by taking out stuff like dates of birth, that it would be, maybe the age is just like above 14, under 14. I'm pretty sure I could do it in such a way that it would be anonymised and no one could be identified. However,
Yeah.
when I did my ethics, I mean, I never said to anyone, take part in my study and I'm going to put it online. And I don't know what my supervisor will think about this, because it is kind of coming from a different generation, really.
Yeah.
So I don't know.
So
any thoughts on that?
Yeah, we make sure to put in our ethics only because we sort of assumed we'd put it online straight away.
Yeah.
So I can understand the dilemma, especially with clinical samples.
Yeah.
Anonymous, it definitely has to be anonymous for,
Yeah, sure.
for obvious reasons. But in the ethics, so the way that we frame information sheets, we always put in now, we're going to put your anonymous data on the Open Science Framework, give them a link to your profile, and just say, this is, if it was a non-clinical sample, you might be able to get away with it, but because it's kind of a vulnerable population, even anonymous data, I think, could be conceived as quite, breaching ethics in that sense. But if you could email them afterwards and go, we're thinking about putting this online, would any of you mind if your anonymous answers went online? And that's always a way forward.
Yeah.
But Joe, people say this, but I really don't see the difference between you publishing a paper and then somebody saying, now look at your data.
Yeah.
It's just en masse. You're doing it en masse.
I think it's because it's en masse and the fact that anyone can access it immediately that makes it a little bit less safeguarded. For good, and that's great, but it does mean that if you're working with a vulnerable population, there might be I can imagine some sort of people who wouldn't be too happy about this. It just, even if it would be fine, just to be safe, we just include that we're going to put your stuff on the Open Science Framework in the info sheet, just to kind of waylay any problems that might come after that, and obviously make sure to put everything that is up there anonymous and non-identifiable, all the other GDPR stuff.
In autumn or in the future, I'm going to invite members of the Research Integrity Office, and they cover all things from research integrity, like misconduct and stuff like this, to GDPR and ethics. And because nobody knows, I mean, if you're like me and you can't learn that entire GDPR in that 20-minute shitty online thing, then you need help. So like that is a major concern of how to sort of be open science. We don't know whether you can or cannot. But even just carrying out the conventional scientific practices, I don't know whether I'm infringing on GDPR even, because it's so unclear to me, it's so opaque. So hopefully we'll get somebody to sort of answer some questions that people have, even to just do the basic stuff. So for example, you have sensitive information, and then you have whatever behaviour data or something that you collect, which is anonymised, and then you have a code to link the two. Now, the old sort of order was that code. Well, the GDPR views that code now, that linking code, as sensitive information. That was not known before, and people usually use that to link the two documents without really caring about the link. They may probably put it, fortunately, in their ethics application, but a lot of people don't know this. The other thing is that the Helsinki Declaration that everybody puts in their methods, it says that all data collected from human samples must be pre-registered, and more often than not, it's not. I mean, so people just don't know these things, and I only found out about it because of Twitter, so it's just by accident. So hopefully we can avoid any major upset and concern and loss of millions by getting somebody to talk about the key issues that people don't know about.
Are you, did you go through NHS ethics?
I did, and this was like 2015, before I was even really thinking about this stuff.
Yeah, that's fair.
But, I mean, at the point of submitting the publication, I'm happy to kind of send people my my code, the database, but I just don't honestly know if I can put it in the public domain. I don't know, I need to find out.
Yeah, I don't know the answer to that either, actually.
Anyway.
I'll have to Google it or something. I don't know. But it's an interesting point, actually. And also NHS ethics are notoriously annoying, so having to kind of go through that rigmarole to put it online might be tough, just because they take forever to do things. I don't know what your experience has been like, mine's been awful, but yeah. Sorry, I would have been more helpful in this, yeah.
It's all about bearing in mind that there are policies that allow secure data access to personal identifiable information. So the European Genome Archive is one. There are others, I think, where you should be able to deposit your data, and then they'll take care of the legal aspects of people accessing your data, not re-identifying individuals.
Are they free to access?
They are. It's beautiful. It is bureaucratic, though, the stuff there. Government access.
Would you mind just repeating that, actually, the name?
European Genome Archive.
Cool.
Any other questions?
I'm going to be hanging around for a bit
Yeah,
anyway.
so it's